We're in effect going to go on a journey. We'll hear part of Mark's account of this day, a few thoughts, and then a pause for us to contemplate and consider before we move on to sing and then stop again. We're going to follow Mark's version of the events of this day, and Rachel's going to read these for us.
We begin at the beginning of Mark chapter 15, which is on page 45 of the Pew Bibles, if you wish to follow it. As soon as morning came, the whole council, chief priests, elders and scribes made their plans. They bound Jesus and led him away to hand him over to Pilate. "Are you the king of the Jews?" Pilate asked him. "The words are yours," he replied. And the chief priests brought many charges against him. Pilate questioned him again. "Have you nothing to say in your defense? You see how many charges they're bringing against you." But to Pilate's astonishment, Jesus made no further reply. At the festival season, the governor used to release one prisoner requested by the people. As it happened, a man known as Barabbas was then in custody with the rebels who had committed murder in the rising. When the crowd appeared and began asking for the usual favour, Pilate replied, "Would you like me to release the King of the Jews?" For he knew it was out of malice that Jesus had been handed over to him. But the chief priests incited the crowd to instead ask for the release of Barabbas. Pilate spoke to them again. "Then what shall I do with the man you call the King of the Jews?" They shouted back, "Crucify him!" "Why? What wrong has he done?" Pilate asked. But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him!" So Pilate, in his desire to satisfy the mob, released Barabbas to them. And he had Jesus flogged and then handed him over to be crucified.
Pilate had a reputation for being fairly brutal. He was a man of his time. But today, I suppose we come to recognize his weakness. His question to the crowd that brayed for Jesus' blood was, what crime has he committed? Knowing in his heart that this was a stitch-up, a set-up. And yet, he allowed Jesus to remain in custody and set Barabbas free. He was swayed by the crowd. He consorted with the voices of those who were evil, who demanded an unjust death. It was a brutal moment, but in a sense, it was a very human moment. It's a time when we need to ask ourselves how easily we are swayed by the crowd. How often have we convicted the innocent? Where have we listened to gossip and given it credit? Where have we indulged in savaging people's reputations? Where have we simply gone with the flow, knowing in our hearts that we should not? Pilate in his weakness brought pain and enabled injustice. There with Jesus in front of him, who simply awaited. Pilate speaks to our humanity, asks us to consider who we are and the way that we add to Christ's agonies as a nail is hammered home.
And I continue from verse 16. The soldiers took him inside the governor's residence, the praetorium, and called the whole company together. They dressed him in purple and plaiting a crown of thorns, placed it on his head. Then they began to salute him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They beat him about the head with a stick and spat at him, and then knelt and paid homage to him. When they had finished their mockery, they stripped off the purple robe and dressed him in his own clothes. Then they led him out to crucify him.
It's too easy to miss that particular part of the story of Good Friday. As this bunch of thugs attack an innocent man, beat him, mock him, insult him. And I suppose we have to ask ourselves two questions. What did they think they were doing? What were they getting out of it? Why did it seem the right thing to do? That's three questions. But the second point, in a sense, is how was Jesus in the midst of this scene? This act of savagery. This place where seemingly there was no trace of love, as these soldiers appear with relish to have undertaken their duty. And while I assume that we don't, as a rule, beat people up, it does perhaps pose questions to us as the church in terms of the people who are not here, who have come in times past and no longer come. who have been put off formal Christian activity because of events and incidents that have taken place, who have suffered at our hands. And while the scene may not be full of blood as it was on that Friday long ago, I suppose it asks questions as how we respond to that scene and how we may have been involved in similar incidents ourselves. As perhaps we hear another nail hammered into a cross. As we think of what our Lord endured for us, even though we are weak and frail, capable of making too many mistakes, for us, he endured this agony.
A man called Simon from Cyrene, the father Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they pressed him into service to carry his cross. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull. And they offered him drugged wine, but he did not take it. Then they fastened him to the cross. They shared out his clothes, casting lots to decide what each should have. It was 9 a.m. when they crucified him, and the inscription given charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." 2 robbers were crucified with him, one on his right and the other on his left. The passers-by wagged their heads and jeered at him. "Bravo," they cried. "So you're the man who was to pull down the temple and rebuild it in 3 days? Save yourself and come down from the cross." The chief priests and scribes joined in, jesting with one another. "He saved others," they say, "but he cannot save himself. Let the Messiah, the King of Israel, come down from the cross. If we see that, we shall believe." Even those who were crucified with him taunted him.
I have on my shelves at home a book by a very well-respected Christian commentator, one of the leading Christian thinkers of the 20th century. And the thing that worries me and concerns me about it is the detail that he chooses to go into as to the nature of the various punishments Jesus endured during the day, down to what type of whips would be used, how brutal it might be. And really, it is most unpleasant reading and not something I would necessarily recommend, because we recognize that today is bad enough. without seeking to understand the details. It's enough to know that it was brutal. It's enough to hear something of the voices in the crowd and the bitter anger that consumed them. And it's horrifying to note that the leading voices calling for this barbaric act were the priests and leaders of the Jews, who perhaps believed that this troublemaker was being removed, the problem being disposed of. Their position, in a sense, was being retrieved. Their authority was not going to be questioned. This nasty man who'd asked too many things was being dealt with what we might call a convenient solution. And yet, we of course know the end of the story. We know that love will gain its victory. We know that the Jesus who appeared to be discarded and abandoned was not alone, because his Father was alongside him, and with the good news of Easter speaks to our hearts and invites us to discover love. Jesus was the victim of religion, of rules and regulations, of entrenched attitudes, of people who were unprepared to think afresh. In the midst of that image of vociferous hatred, a figure full of love hangs. As the hymn puts it, see from his head, his hands, his feet, sorrow and love flow mingled down. As we walk this way of suffering, this Via Dolorosa, we remind ourselves that there are glimmers of hope. There is the good news of Easter to come, that here on this day we recognize love made manifest in its purest form, the Jesus who went to the cross so that you and I could know life and life in all its fullness. Yes, we need to pause and with due solemnity recognize what this day is all about. But equally we need to pause and recognize there is a solution to our frailty, a solution to our ignorance, that this cross speaks of life and hope and love and the potential for joy. But we need to walk this way and see the Jesus who poured himself out even for us. Here, God's love is made manifest. Here, evil is defeated. Here, eternity begins to speak. As to we who do not deserve it, love is offered. And we need, therefore, to embrace the darkness of this day, and with the glimmer of hope, contemplate its significance. Share in a vigil that allows us to understand more of what Easter is all about. And the Jesus who walked the challenging way of love, the way of humility, and from the cross says to us, here is my love for you. At the 6th hour, darkness came over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? When some of those standing near heard this, they said, listen, he's calling to Elijah. One man ran, filled a sponge with wine vinegar, put it on a stick, and offered it to Jesus to drink. Now, leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to take him down, he said. And with a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood in front of Jesus heard his cry and saw how he died, he said, surely this man was the Son of God. In a sense, we mark today how a light was extinguished. How the sky turned black. How hope seemed to have died. How human folly appeared to gain its victory. And we commit ourselves to journey for a few hours with this darkness, knowing that light will come, and to contemplate what these events say of who we are, of how we respond to the call of faith, how we respond to our Lord. It invites us to look in the mirror and see our frailty and confess it. To look in the mirror to see our arrogance and confess it. To see our struggles with faith and confess them. It invites us to stand in this place where Eric stands and look and see love in its purest form and know that that love is for us.